The church was a hollow shell of shattered dreams, its stained glass windows catching the late afternoon sun like fragments of a broken promise. The pews, once filled with whispered hopes and tearful vows, now sat empty, their silence louder than the organ's forgotten hymns. Daniel Hartley stood alone at the altar, his tailored tuxedo clinging to his sweat-soaked skin, his hands trembling as he clutched a single white rose. The petals were wilting, just like the future he'd imagined only hours ago. His bride-to-be, Clara, had walked down the aisle, her gown a cascade of ivory lace, her smile radiant, until she stopped, her eyes cold as winter, and said, "I can't do this." The words were a guillotine, severing his heart in front of 200 guests. She turned and left, her heels clicking on the stone floor, leaving Daniel to face the gasps, the pity, the weight of rejection that crushed him like a collapsing star. He hadn't moved since, not when the guests shuffled out, not when the priest murmured condolences, not when the sun began to sink, painting the altar in hues of blood and gold. His mind replayed her words, each syllable a wound. "I can't do this, why?" He'd given her everything, his love, his trust, a diamond ring that cost more than his childhood home. He'd built a life for them, a fortress of plans and promises, and she'd torn it down with 5 words. His knees buckled, and he sank to the steps, the rose slipping from his fingers, its thorns pricking his palm. Blood welled, a small red bead, and he stared at it, numb, as if it could explain the void in his chest. The church door creaked, a sound that jolted him from his spiral. He looked up, expecting a stray guest or the janitor, but instead, a stranger stood there, a woman, mid-50s, her coat threadbare, her face etched with lines of a life hard-lived. Her eyes, though, were soft, like they'd seen pain and chosen kindness anyway. She carried a small paper bag, its edges worn, and her steps were hesitant as she approached. Daniel straightened, his jaw tight, ready to dismiss her, to cling to his solitude. But she stopped a few feet away, her voice low, steady. "You don't know me," she said, "but I saw what happened. I was outside, waiting for the bus. I'm sorry." Her words were simple, but they carried a weight, a sincerity that pierced his defenses. He didn't respond, his throat too raw, his pride too bruised. She didn't push. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small, wrapped sandwich, its bread slightly squashed. "I don't have much," she said, setting it on the pew beside him, "but no one should be alone like this. Eat something. It helps." He stared at the sandwich, then at her, his mind grappling with the absurdity of it, a stranger's kindness in the wreckage of his life. "Why?" he croaked, his voice barely audible. "Why do you care?" Her smile was faint, tinged with sadness. "Because I've been where you are. Not at an altar, but broken. Someone helped me once. Now it's my turn." She didn't wait for a reply. She turned and walked away, her footsteps fading, the door creaking shut behind her. Daniel sat there, the sandwich untouched, her words echoing in the emptiness. Someone helped me once, he didn't know why it mattered, why her small act felt like a lifeline when his world had collapsed. But as the light faded, he picked up the sandwich, unwrapped it, and took a bite. It was plain, ham, cheese, a smear of mustard, but it grounded him, tethering him to the moment. He didn't know her name, didn't know if he'd ever see her again, but in that instant, she was the only thing keeping him from falling apart. Hours later, he stood, the rose forgotten on the floor, and walked out into the dusk. The city was alive, indifferent to his pain, its lights blurring through the tears he hadn't realized he'd shed. He didn't go home. Instead, he wandered, his feet carrying him to a bridge overlooking the river, where the water shimmered like a mirror of his fractured heart. He leaned against the railing, the sandwich wrapper still in his pocket, and whispered to no one, "I don't know how to start over." But the stranger's voice lingered, a faint echo, "It helps," and somehow, it did. 6 months before the altar, Daniel was a man on the cusp of everything. His tech startup had just gone public, his name splashed across headlines, his bank account swollen with numbers that felt surreal. He was 32, charming, driven, the kind of man who walked into a room and owned it. Clara was his perfect match, elegant, ambitious, her laughter like music that made his world brighter. They'd met at a gala, her red dress catching his eye, her wit keeping him hooked. Within months, they were engaged, their lives a whirlwind of plans, a spring wedding, a house in the hills, a future that gleamed like polished glass. But beneath the shine, there were cracks. Clara's smiles grew strained, her silences longer. She'd cancel dinners, citing work, but her eyes held secrets Daniel couldn't read. He told himself it was stress, that love would smooth the edges. He didn't see the late-night texts she hid, the way her gaze drifted when he spoke of their vows. One night, at a rooftop restaurant, he reached for her hand, his voice soft. "We're going to be happy, Clara. I promise." She looked at him, her expression unreadable, and said, "I hope so." The words were a warning, but he didn't hear it. He was too busy dreaming, too busy building a life she wasn't sure she wanted. That same night, as they left the restaurant, Daniel noticed a woman at the corner, her coat patched, her hands sorting through a bag of cans. She looked up, her eyes meeting his for a fleeting moment, and he felt a pang, guilt, maybe, or something deeper. He didn't stop, didn't think to. Clara tugged his arm, her voice sharp. "Come on, it's cold." He followed, but the woman's face stayed with him, a shadow in his perfect world. He didn't know then that she'd be the one to save him, that her kindness would be the thread pulling him back from the abyss. 3 years earlier, Daniel was still climbing, his startup a gamble that hadn't yet paid off. He worked 18-hour days, his apartment a mess of coffee cups and code. Love was a luxury he couldn't afford, but loneliness was a constant companion. One rainy evening, he stopped at a diner, its neon sign flickering, its booths worn but warm. He ordered coffee, his eyes on his laptop, when a waitress, older, her apron stained, set a plate of pie in front of him. "On the house," she said, her voice kind. "You look like you need it." He blinked, caught off guard, and mumbled a thank you. Her name tag read Margaret, and her smile was a small light in his gray world. They talked, just for a moment, about nothing, rain, the city, the pie's recipe. She didn't know he was chasing a dream that could make him millions, didn't care. She saw a tired young man and offered what she could. He left a generous tip, more than he could afford, and walked into the rain, feeling lighter. He didn't know her story, didn't know she'd lost a son to addiction, that her kindness was born of pain. But her pie, her words, stayed with him, a reminder that even in his darkest moments, someone saw him. Years later, on the bridge after the altar, Daniel thought of her. Margaret. The stranger at the church. The women who, without knowing it, had woven a thread through his life. He pulled the sandwich wrapper from his pocket, its edges crumpled, and made a decision. He wouldn't let Clara's rejection define him. He'd find a way forward, not for her, but for himself, and for the strangers who'd shown him that kindness could heal what love had broken. The river flowed below, steady and unbroken, and for the first time that day, he felt the faint stir of hope. The city was a maze of ambition and ache, its skyscrapers clawing at a sky that refused to yield. 6 months before the altar shattered Daniel Hartley's world, he was a man riding the crest of success, his tech startup a beacon in the industry, his name a whisper in elite circles. At 32, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd beaten the odds, his smile sharp, his eyes bright with the future. Clara was his anchor, his muse, her elegance a counterpoint to his drive. They were the couple everyone envied, engaged, unstoppable, their love a story written in starlight. But beneath the gloss, there were shadows, moments that flickered like a faulty bulb, too brief to notice but too heavy to ignore. Daniel spent his days in boardrooms, his nights planning a wedding that would be the talk of the city. Clara was beside him, her hand in his, her laughter a melody he thought would never fade. Yet, there were nights when she'd pull away, her phone glowing in the dark, her fingers tapping out messages she didn't share. "Work," she'd say, her voice light but her eyes distant. Daniel believed her, or wanted to. He'd built his life on trust, on the idea that love was a contract signed in good faith. He didn't see the cracks widening, didn't hear the quiet warnings in her silences. He was too busy dreaming, too busy carving a place for them in a world that demanded perfection. One evening, in the soft glow of a rooftop restaurant, Daniel felt the weight of her distance. The city sparkled below, a tapestry of lights, and he reached for her hand, his voice earnest. "Clara, we're going to have it all. The house, the life, the love. I promise." Her fingers stiffened in his, her smile a fragile thing. "I hope so," she said, her gaze drifting to the horizon. The words hung between them, a thread too thin to hold. He wanted to ask, to press, but her hand slipped from his, and she changed the subject, her laughter forced. He let it go, telling himself it was nerves, that weddings brought out fears even in the strongest hearts. But deep down, a seed of doubt took root, small and sharp, like a thorn under skin. As they left the restaurant, the autumn air biting, Daniel's eyes caught a figure at the corner, a woman, her coat patched, her hands sorting through a bag of cans. Her face was lined, her hair graying, but her movements were steady, purposeful. She looked up, her eyes meeting his for a moment, and something stirred in him, guilt, perhaps, or a fleeting recognition. He didn't know her, didn't stop, but her presence lingered, a quiet contrast to the polished world he inhabited. Clara tugged his arm, her voice sharp. "Daniel, it's freezing. Let's go." He followed, his steps heavy, the woman's face etched in his mind like a photograph he couldn't place. He didn't know then that she'd be the one to offer him salvation, that her kindness would anchor him when his world fell apart. That night, in their sleek apartment, Daniel tried to bridge the gap. He poured wine, dimmed the lights, and pulled Clara close, his voice soft. "Tell me what's wrong. I can fix it." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Nothing's wrong," she said, her tone too smooth, too practiced. "I'm just tired." She kissed him, a fleeting brush of lips, and turned away, her phone buzzing on the counter. He watched her silhouette against the city lights, a stranger in the body of the woman he loved. The doubt grew, a whisper in his chest, but he silenced it. He was Daniel Hartley, the man who made things happen, who turned dreams into reality. He wouldn't let fear unravel what he'd built. Weeks passed, and the cracks deepened. Clara missed fittings, canceled plans, her excuses piling like leaves in a storm. Daniel threw himself into work, into wedding plans, as if action could drown the unease. He hired planners, chose flowers, booked a church with windows that caught the sun like a blessing. He wanted it perfect, wanted her to see his love in every detail. But at night, when she slept, he'd lie awake, her phone a silent sentinel on her nightstand. He never checked it, never crossed that line, but the temptation was there, a shadow he couldn't shake. He told himself it was nothing, that love was trust, that Clara was his forever. But forever felt fragile, like glass under pressure. One afternoon, in a rare moment of quiet, Daniel found himself at a park, the engagement ring heavy in his pocket. He'd been carrying it, a habit born of nerves, as if touching it could anchor their future. Children laughed, their voices bright, and he watched them, imagining a life with Clara, with a family. A woman sat on a bench nearby, her coat worn, her hands folded around a thermos. She looked familiar, her face carrying the same quiet strength he'd seen at the restaurant corner. She didn't notice him, her gaze on the children, but her presence was a jolt, a reminder of something he couldn't name. He wanted to speak, to ask who she was, but his phone rang. "Clara," her voice clipped. "Where are you?" "We're late for the planner." He left, the woman's face fading, but not forgotten. Back in the whirl of their life, Daniel clung to Clara, to the idea of them. He proposed again, privately, on their balcony, his voice trembling. "Marry me, Clara. Let's make this real." She nodded, her eyes wet, but her embrace was fleeting, her warmth a ghost. He didn't see the hesitation, didn't want to. He saw only the ring on her finger, the promise of a life together. But promises, he'd learn, were only as strong as the hearts that made them. 3 years before, when his startup was a gamble and his dreams were raw, Daniel had crossed paths with another stranger. In a diner, under flickering neon, a waitress named Margaret had given him pie and a moment of kindness. Her smile had been a beacon, her words a balm for his weary soul. He hadn't thought of her in years, but her memory lingered, a quiet thread in the tapestry of his life. Now, as he stood on the edge of losing everything, those moments of kindness, Margaret's, the woman at the corners, began to weave together, forming a lifeline he didn't yet understand. In the months leading to the altar, Daniel's world was a paradox, bright with success, dim with doubt. He didn't know Clara was slipping away, didn't know her heart was elsewhere. He didn't know a stranger's sandwich would be his salvation, or that the woman he'd seen twice would be the key to his redemption. But as he planned his wedding, as he ignored the warnings, the city watched, indifferent, waiting for the moment it would break him, and the moment it would save him. The rain was a relentless whisper, soaking the city in a grief that mirrored Daniel Hartley's own. 3 years before the altar where Clara would shatter his heart, Daniel was a man chasing a dream that felt just out of reach. His startup was a fragile thing, a house of cards built on code and ambition, its future hinging on investors who saw potential but demanded proof. At 29, he was all sharp edges and restless energy, his days a blur of meetings, his nights spent hunched over a laptop in a cramped apartment that smelled of instant coffee and desperation. Love was a distant thought, a luxury for men with time to spare. But loneliness clung to him like damp clothes, a constant weight he couldn't shake. He moved through the city like a ghost, its lights too bright, its noise too loud. His world was narrow, code, pitches, the occasional beer with colleagues who didn't know his past. He'd grown up in a small town, the son of a mechanic and a schoolteacher, his childhood a patchwork of modest means and big dreams. He'd left that life behind, chasing success, but the city didn't care about his story. It demanded results, and Daniel was determined to deliver, even if it meant sacrificing sleep, health, connection. He told himself it was temporary, that one day he'd have it all, money, stability, someone to share it with. But that day felt far, and the nights were long. One evening, the sky opened, rain pounding the streets like a judgment. Daniel ducked into a diner, its neon sign flickering, its warmth a refuge from the storm. He was soaked, his jacket heavy, his mood darker than the clouds outside. He ordered coffee, black, and opened his laptop, the screen's glow a harsh contrast to the diner's soft light. The place was nearly empty, just a few stragglers nursing their meals. The waitress approached, her apron stained, her hair pulled back in a loose bun. Her name tag read Margaret, and her face carried the kind of tire that came from years, not hours. She set a plate of apple pie in front of him, unasked, her voice gentle. "On the house," she said. "You look like you could use something sweet." Daniel blinked, caught off guard, his usual defenses faltering. "I didn't order this," he said, his tone sharper than he meant. She didn't flinch, her smile small but steady. "I know," she said. "But sometimes you need more than coffee to keep going." He stared at her, then at the pie, its crust golden, its filling warm. Something in her eyes, kindness, maybe, or understanding, made him pause. He mumbled a thank you, his voice rough, and she nodded, moving to another table. He took a bite, the sweetness cutting through his bitterness, and for a moment, the world felt less heavy. They talked, just for a few minutes, as she refilled his coffee. Nothing deep, rain, the city, the diner's history. She mentioned the sun, her voice catching, but didn't elaborate. He didn't ask. He told her about his startup, the words spilling out, surprising him. She listened, her eyes attentive, not with pity but with a quiet respect. "You're going to make it," she said, as if it were fact, not hope. "Just don't forget to live while you're building." Her words stayed with him, a warmth he hadn't expected, a spark in his gray routine. When he left, He slipped a 20 under his plate, more than he could spare, and stepped into the rain, feeling lighter, like he'd left a piece of his burden behind. Margaret didn't know it, but that night marked him. He didn't see her again, didn't return to the diner, but her kindness lingered, a thread woven into the fabric of his life. He threw himself back into work, the pie a memory he tucked away, but it changed something in him. He started noticing the city's forgotten corners, the street vendors, the cleaners, the people who kept the world turning. He'd drop coins in a busker's hat, buy coffee for a stranger, small acts that felt like paying forward what Margaret had given him. He didn't know her story, didn't know she'd lost her son to addiction, that her kindness was a choice born of pain. But he felt it, the weight of her generosity, and it carried him through the grind. 2 years later, when his startup began to soar, Daniel's life was transforming. He moved to a better apartment, traded his worn jacket for tailored suits, his name gaining traction in tech circles. He met Clara, her charm a whirlwind, her ambition a mirror to his own. Love came fast, a rush that drowned out the loneliness he'd carried for years. But even as he fell for her, as he planned a future with her, there were moments when he'd pause, a stranger's face catching his eye, a woman at a corner, a figure in a park, and feel a pang, a memory of kindness he couldn't place. He didn't know then that the woman he'd seen twice, the one who'd one day offer him a sandwich in a church, was connected to Margaret, to the thread of compassion that had begun to shape him. Back in those pre-Clara days, Daniel was still learning who he was. He'd call his parents, their voices a tether to his roots, but the city was his home now, its pulse his own. He'd walk its streets, the rain a constant companion, and think of Margaret's words, "Don't forget to live," he tried, in his own way, buying a stranger's groceries, leaving tips that made waitresses smile. But ambition was a hungry thing, and it consumed him, narrowing his world until Clara entered it, her light blinding him to the shadows. Now, looking back from the bridge where he stood after the altar's collapse, Daniel saw the pattern. Margaret's pie, the woman's sandwich, the fleeting glances at a stranger in a worn coat, they were anchors, moments of humanity that held him when love failed. He didn't know their names, didn't know their stories, but they'd seen him, not as a CEO, not as a failure, but as a man. And as he gripped the sandwich wrapper, the river flowing below, he felt the stir of something new, not love, not yet, but a resolve to be the kind of man who'd earn their kindness, who'd give it back tenfold. The city hummed, indifferent, but for the first time in years, Daniel felt alive. The city exhaled into dawn, its streets slick with the remnants of a night's rain, its lights fading like stars swallowed by morning. Daniel Hartley stood at the edge of a small community center, its brick facade weathered but warm, a beacon in the gray sprawl. 6 months had passed since Clara left him at the altar, since her words, "I can't do this," carved a wound that bled pride and hope. The pain lingered, a dull ache, but it no longer defined him. The sandwich wrapper from that day, crumpled and faded, was still in his desk drawer, a relic of the stranger's kindness that had pulled him from the abyss. Margaret's pie, years earlier, was a memory woven into his bones, a reminder of a life he'd almost forgotten to live. Now, he was here, chasing a thread of redemption, a chance to give back what he'd been given. The community center buzzed with quiet purpose, volunteers sorting donations, children laughing in a makeshift classroom, the scent of coffee and fresh paint mingling in the air. Daniel had found it by chance, or perhaps fate, after weeks of searching for the woman who'd left the sandwich. He hadn't found her, didn't know her name, but he'd learned she volunteered here, her presence a quiet force in a place that stitched broken lives back together. He'd come to understand her through others. Her name was Ellen, a widow who'd lost a daughter to illness, who turned her grief into acts of compassion. She was the woman he'd seen at the corner, in the park, her face a recurring note in the symphony of his life. Daniel hadn't come to confront her, or even to thank her. He'd come to act, to be more than the man who'd crumbled at an altar. He'd started small, donating to the center, then volunteering, his hands sorting clothes, his voice reading to kids who clung to every word. It was humbling, grounding, a far cry from the boardrooms where he'd built his empire. But it felt right, like a puzzle piece clicking into place. He didn't tell anyone who he was, didn't flaunt his wealth. He was just Daniel, a man learning to see the world through Ellen's eyes, through Margaret's, through the countless others who'd shown him kindness when he was too blind to see it. This morning, the center was hosting a breakfast for the neighborhood, a modest affair of pancakes and orange juice, tables crowded with faces young and old. Daniel worked the serving line, his sleeves rolled up, his smile genuine. He ladled batter onto a griddle, the sizzle a steady rhythm, his mind at ease for the first time in years. He didn't notice her at first, didn't see Ellen until she was there, across the counter, her coat still worn but her eyes bright with a warmth that stopped his breath. She held a tray, her hands steady, her face carrying the same quiet strength he'd seen in the church. "Pancakes?" he asked, his voice catching, a question heavier than it seemed. She nodded, her smile faint but real. "Please," she said, her voice soft, like a memory. He served her, his hands trembling, the weight of that day in the church pressing against his chest. She didn't recognize him, or if she did, she didn't say. But as she took the plate, her fingers brushed his, a fleeting touch that felt like a bridge across time. "Thank you," she said, and he heard it, the same sincerity, the same care that had saved him. He wanted to speak, to tell her what her sandwich had meant, but the words caught in his throat, too big for the moment. She moved on, joining a table of volunteers, her laughter a soft note in the room's hum. Daniel watched her, his heart a tangle of gratitude and resolve. He thought of Clara, of the love that had broken him, and realized it no longer held power. The altar was a scar, not a shackle. He thought of Margaret, her pie a spark that had lit his way, and of Ellen, her sandwich a lifeline when he'd been drowning. They were strangers, yet they'd shaped him, their kindness a mirror showing him who he could be. He didn't need Clara's love, didn't need the world's applause. He needed this, the warmth of a shared meal, the weight of a purpose bigger than himself. As the breakfast wound down, Daniel stepped outside, the air crisp, the city waking around him. He saw Ellen near the door, her coat buttoned, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. She was talking to a child, her voice gentle, her presence a quiet anchor. He approached, his steps slow, his heart steady. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low but clear. She turned, her eyes meeting his, and for a moment, he saw recognition, a flicker, nothing more. "I just wanted to say, this place is special. You're doing something real here." Her smile widened, a warmth that felt like home. "We're just trying to help," she said. "It's what keeps us going." He nodded, his throat tight. "Someone helped me once," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A sandwich, in a church. It changed everything." Her eyes softened, but she didn't speak, didn't need to. The moment was enough, a silent understanding that bound them. He didn't tell her it was her, didn't need her to know. It wasn't about recognition, it was about continuation, about carrying her kindness forward. Daniel walked away, the community center behind him, the city stretching out like a canvas. He'd fund the center anonymously, ensure it thrived, but he'd keep coming back, keep serving, keep learning. The rose he'd held at the altar was gone, its thorns a memory, but in its place was something stronger, a resolve to live, not for love lost, but for love given freely, without expectation. Ellen's sandwich, Margaret's pie, the countless small acts that had saved him, they were his compass now, guiding him toward a life that mattered. The sun rose, painting the city gold, and Daniel felt it, a peace he hadn't known he'd been seeking. The past was a shadow, the future a promise, and he'd walk toward it, one step at a time, carrying the kindness that had changed his life forever.